I will be giving an overview of habitats and species management with particular focus on the breeding waders, northern lapwing, common snipe and the common redshank, and their requirements during the nesting and early life stages of the chicks. We will deal with the context, the breeding ecology of the species, linking that breeding ecology to scorecards, and other sporting actions that can take place. Many species of bird are in decline all over Europe, with ground nesting birds being particularly affected. In some cases, there have been dramatic reductions in the breeding population. In Ireland, this is particularly evident for the Eurasian curlew, another ground nesting wader. On the right hand side in this slide, you can see a synthesis of breeding wader abundance in the first European breeding bird atlas. It illustrates areas where there was a decline in the abundance of breeding waders over the 20 years from 1988 to 2008. And there are more recent data being available in the second European breeding bird atlas, which was published in 2020. The causes of these declines are multifaceted, with many linked to changes in land use practices driven by policy decisions promoting agricultural production. Expansion and intensification of agriculture has resulted in homogeneous landscapes of pasture, crops and timber plantations, which are replacing natural grasslands, wetlands and forests. The effects of these changes are compounded by predation, human disturbance and climate change. Predation-related reductions in survival of eggs and chicks may be linked to increased numbers of mesopredators, such as corvids, and increased vulnerability of eggs and chicks to predation as a result of degraded habitat. Disturbance during agricultural operations may result in nest destruction, be that from machinery operations or where the density of livestock in the habitat is so high that the risk of trampling is increased. Waders, like many other species of bird, have particular requirements for breeding. They nest on the ground, and they use a variety of habitat types during breeding, relying on vegetation for cover, yet also providing them with enough of a view to watch for predators. On the top right-hand side, you can see a mosaic of long and short vegetation that is an ideal breeding habitat for species such as lapwing, snipe, and redshank. While the lapwing will prefer areas of shorter vegetation, species like snipe, redshank, and indeed curlew may prefer slightly taller vegetation for nesting, as these are cryptic nesting species. Nesting and egg laying are the precursors to hatching, rearing, and eventually fledging chicks. As insect-eating birds, they require access to suitable wet areas as a source of insects for feeding adults and chicks. Once hatched, adults will move chicks to areas in proximity to the nesting habitat that can provide access to food. This may be areas such as that seen on the bottom right-hand side of the slide, or more defined shallow pools with gently sloping edges and exposed mud. Problems arise when suitable habitat is not available. What constitutes unsuitable habitat will depend on the species in question, but broadly speaking, it will relate to the structure of the habitat. For example, the vegetation could be homogeneous, either being too short as a result of overgrazing or too long as a result of undergrazing, as in the image on the top right-hand side. Both of these will reduce the suitability of the habitat for breeding waders in general, with some exceptions. For example, snipe prefer slightly taller grasses for breeding. Another aspect of the structure of the habitat that will render it unsuitable for breeding waders is the presence of woodland and forestry. Waders are birds that have evolved to use open landscape for nesting and rearing chicks. As a result, they tend to avoid wooded areas. Where forestry is established in proximity to or within breeding wader habitat, then breeding waders will tend to avoid them due to increased risk of predation. Northern lapwing, seen here in the bottom right, tend to arrive on breeding grounds in late February and early March. They'll have nests with eggs in April and the young will hatch in May. Common redshank will lay eggs around mid-April to mid-June. The young will hatch about 3.5 weeks after that and the young will fledge about 4 weeks after that. Snipe, seen here in the top right, tend to nest slightly later, perhaps laying eggs as late as the end of June, with the young fledging in July. What we know about the breeding ecology of these species has been used to develop the content of the scorecards. They are to be used in known breeding wader hotspots or areas where there is evidence of the presence of waders between March and July, which is based on the known breeding ecology of these species. The Acres Breeding Wader Scorecard considers the vegetative and hydrological conditions of the site in the context of the breeding ecology of these species, as well as the threats and pressures of relevance to breeding waders. You will have covered plant species identification with my colleagues, and from an ecological integrity perspective, the number of species and percentage cover of plant species that are both positive indicators as well as those that are deemed to be negative indicators, such as docks, ragworts, thistles, and nettles, are important considerations, the percentage cover being determined by the encounter rate while you walk the habitat. Of significant importance in terms of scores under the ecological integrity component is the structural quality of the sward in terms of homogeneity and height. Habitat of poor quality will be homogeneous and have a sward height greater than 15 centimeters over most of the area, for example, on the picture on the bottom right. Habitat of moderate quality will be homogeneous and have a sward height of less than 5 centimeters over most of the area, effectively the opposite of the picture on the bottom right. Habitat of high quality will present as a heterogeneous mosaic of vegetation between 5 and 15 centimeters in height over most of the area, as in image on the top right. This represents the optimum nesting habitat for a range of wader species. You must pay particular attention to rush cover in the habitat and decide what the most dominant type present is. Either dense rush, as in the image on the bottom right, or sparse rush, as in the image on the bottom left. This is a binary scoring. You either use the left one or the right one, dense rush or sparse rush. Where dense rush is the most dominant type and has a high occurrence within the habitat, this reduces the quality of the habitat for breeding waders. Dense rush, where present, is a positive aspect provided it is confined to one area or has a low, less than 30%, or very low, less than 10% of the habitat in terms of cover. Where sparse rush is present, it's less problematic for breeding waders, as can be seen from the respective possible scores depending on the extent of its cover within the habitat. As I discussed earlier, waders are wetland birds, and while they will choose relatively dry areas for nests, they will need access to wet areas when the chicks are foraging. Not all wet areas or features are suitable for waders and their chicks, but those that are may be low-lying patches where the water table is at the surface. They could equally be drains, pools, or margins of rivers and streams. The margins should not be completely covered with vegetation to the extent that there are no bare patches. Poor quality habitat will have no accessible wet features for birds to feed. Where the wet features are present, they should not be dried out, or have sides that are too steep to prevent safe access and exit. Here we see examples of both good and poor quality wet features within a habitat. The two on the left are both open with shallow water and a mosaic of vegetated and non-vegetated areas. Note also the slope of the ground to the wet areas is gradual, permitting safe access and exit for the young birds. Contrast that with the image on the far right, where there are steep banks presenting a risk to young birds, and no areas of wet vegetation to provide insects as food. Here we consider activities that will negatively affect the ecological integrity of the structure and function of the habitat, both from a broader ecological perspective, but also through the lens of breeding wader ecology. Threats to vegetation incur significant penalties, even if at relatively low rates of occurrence, recognizing the importance of vegetation in the structure of the habitat and the reliance of breeding waders on appropriate composition, cover, and height of vegetation. Threats to water quality also incur significant penalties, and this recognizes the importance of wet areas as feeding habitat for chicks. Where water quality deteriorates, this will adversely affect the aquatic insect community, significantly reducing the quality of the habitat for young birds. Of particular concern under the threats and pressures is the presence of scrub and trees. It's not that scrub or trees are inherently of inferior quality when it comes to habitat structure and function, but as waders are birds of open landscapes, the presence of scrub and trees in an area reduces the quality of the habitat for breeding waders. In assessing the impact of scrub and trees, you must consider three aspects, and here scrub could be determined or defined as bramble, blackthorn, whitethorn, hazel, gorse, or willow. The first thing we must consider is the extent of immature scrub as a measure of its spreading. An example is the image on the left-hand side. Where this is sparse and less than 1 meter in height, it should have limited impact. The second thing we must consider is an example on the image on the top right. Here this is established scrub and we must consider its extent. If the spread and growth has developed where the extent and or height is increased, then the risk of predation is increased and the quality of the habitat for breeding waders is reduced. Finally, you must consider the presence of trees, as in the image on the right, as their presence can also increase the risk of predation. The final part of the threats and pressure scores is the presence of machinery operations. As breeding waders are ground nesting birds, machinery has the potential to destroy nests and young. And for this reason, it's very important that no machinery operations are undertaken within habitats that have breeding waders present from mid-March until late June. Evidence of the presence of machinery operations significantly impacts the overall score. Possible management recommendations would be specific to each site, depending on its overall suitability as breeding wader habitat and any designations in place at the site. The recommendations could focus on one or more of the ecological integrity, hydrology, or threats and pressures. There may be temporary or medium to longer term changes to the habitat. For example, grazing may be used to manage vegetation height prior to the onset of breeding, and then aim to have a stocking rate of no more than one livestock unit during the breeding season from the 15th of March to the 30th of June. Appropriate control measures to remove invasive species or encroaching or established shrub could also be used. From a hydrological perspective, wader scrapes, such as the one seen in the image here, could be created. These do not need to be very deep, no more than a few centimeters, but will provide suitable feeding habitat for young birds. It may also be possible to reprofile the sides of drains or ditches to increase their suitability as habitat for breeding waders. Similarly, it may be appropriate to implement various methods of predator control. To summarize, the context for consideration of breeding wader habitat quality is the decline in breeding wader abundance, which has been linked to agricultural intensification in response to national and EU policies. Waders are birds of open landscapes, preferring a mosaic of vegetation providing suitable nesting sites, with associated wet areas to provide food for chicks. With that in mind, habitat quality is reduced when it is homogeneous and the sward height is too high. The absence of appropriate wet areas or features, or the presence of features of poor water quality will further reduce the habitat quality for breeding waders, as will the presence of extensive areas of scrub or woodland providing cover for predators. Implementation of management actions such as the appropriate grazing, control of invasive species in scrub, together with improvements in hydrology and protection from predators can improve the quality of habitat for breeding waders, and this is reflected in the categories in the score.